Good evening. This is Chipacon, and welcome to Otherworldly, the weekly show for Changing Times, Changing Worlds. Tonight we have Jane Sibley, who is one of the co-founders, but mostly what she is she is a historian, among other things, author. She has written many books, and she really knows a lot about the runes, and is one of those few people who learned it. I think they would say that she learned her magic from her family, passed down. Her grandmother taught her. So she knows a whole lot of stuff. And luckily has the ability to write it all for us. So tonight she's going to be talking about the magical world of, well, we shouldn't say the Vikings, we should say the Scandinavians in the early period. And that is what we're going to she's going to be talking about. So let's see, I'm turning it on to speaker view. And we'll see if we can get on Jane. Oh, where's Jane?
I'm here.
Yes, I'm trying. There you are. All you have to do is speak so that it automatically goes on you. So take it away, Jane.
What a bump. Rim shot. Okay. Well, let's start out with the deities. What were the most frequently known or the most honored deities in period? And if you are familiar with runes, you'll know that the three families of runes, or etir, are named. The first one is for Frey and Freya, which were the gods of the natural earth, and also Ahuma, and rubbing sticks together, as it were. And the second one, Hagal's Et, or hailstone family, is linked with Thor, which was the supernatural sky. The third one was linked with Tyr, who was the actions of humans and what a human could do, but also honor. Odin had nothing to do with runes until Snorri Sturlason, in the 1200s or so, all of a sudden put him in charge. But the runes, when Odin got codified, were already in the younger Futhark and not in the elder Futhark. Okay, Odin was a relative latecomer to the deities. He was pretty much a death god, a psychopomp. There was a tale of him in a haunted ship with skeletons. It's sort of like the Flying Dutchman. He was not necessarily altruistic. Loki came up from Denmark, and he was a terrestrial fire elemental. He started out sort of a trickster, changeling. And if you look at the sagas or whatever, Thor was actually the only one, the supernatural fire, the cosmic fire, who could grab Loki and, deal with him. The others had a hard time. Some of the other gods that we know are Ullr, Skadi, and Sif, who probably came to the Norse via the Sami. The Sami were what one used to call the Lapps. Lapp in Norwegian means a tattered piece of cloth, which is not a good name. It's just like calling the Navajo instead of Dina, which just meant the people. Ullr and Skadi, they were in the mountains, skis, and Ullr was also called a shield god because he had this round thing, but that was the Sami shaman drum, the Govadas. And if you see the movie The Pathfinder, which in Swedish is Vävisaren, you will see that was the hammer was used to, and the arpa, which is the little ring or whatever, would go from pattern to pattern to pattern to pattern to show which path the people should take. Interestingly enough, the more modern shape of Thor's hammer, which goes down like this with a short handle, comes from the Sami drum beater, which goes down and has a short handle. And the Sami thunder god was sometimes called Horragales, from Thorkalle, which meant Thor fellow, but also Djerme, which is the local name. And it's interesting, cultural, because the Sami had long-term cultural exchange with settled people, and but vice versa, because like Horragales, Thor fellow, went into the Sami. Another god then, and Skadi, who was originally, she picked out Njord from his nice feet, but wound up shacking out with Ullr. And she was essentially the female Sami goddess. Sif, who was Thor's sweetie, it turns out, the whole story of Loki cutting her hair and Thor getting pissed off, grabbing Loki, squeezing him, and then Loki had to have the dwarves make golden hair that would fit on her head and would grow like normal hair. That was from when you burned off a pasture. The following year, you see, the acid soil, the ashes would buffer it, and the next year the crop would be much better, and you would have far fewer ticks and stuff like that. And Sif was essentially modeled after the Sami goddess Rananade, who was the reindeer grass maiden, and who provided the good food for the reindeer. If anybody has any questions, I'll be looking at the chat now and again. The Sami were considered extremely.
Or you could unmute yourself and just say something.
The Sami were considered to be extremely powerful magicians. And so the source of magic came from the north, which is why water taking from a brook or water that flowed from the north was extremely powerful, as opposed to water that flowed up. And even after conversion times, the pulpit was set in the north so that the power would flow over the head of the preacher down to the people. The Sami had theoretically could also send shot, skot, and fin shot was sent from the north, and you should hear it sort of humming through the air, which is why people would keep animals that were less valuable to the north of their pasture, and the more valuable ones the south. The Ganflue, magic fly, which was actually a warble fly, was used in magic. They would sometimes make little metal ones and float them in bowls of water so that an animal that was sick would drink from it, and then the Ganflue would take that down into the water. And you see that symbol on the shaman drum, but you see the Ganflue, and Gan means tool using magic. You find that also in the Norse. Now, they had stone circles. The Sami had stone sort of circles that they lay out with a central area, which generally had a tree that was uprooted with the roots in the air. And so that you would have the link to the cosmos down. And so you would have the scythe or essentially meditations inside that circle. And scythe went into Norse, like you would have the scythe kuna or scythe man would do in the utiseata, we're sitting in a high place, doing shaman, doing voyaging, as it were, And, I've done that. I've been trained in that. And you go out and you go right up to the veil and you are communicating with those who have gone beyond and then bring back information. I always like to have somebody who is that I can just link it directly to so that I can go closer to the veil than if I had to just directly link with each individual person that was asking questions. Sometimes there would be a song, like there was one of the sagas said there was a song called Vaderlökkur, which means be thou brought in. And it was a Christian girl that knew that song from old times. I forget which saga it was, whether it was the Iceland saga or whatever. But I work better with, a slow beat on a drum. But anyway, but there's also, if one is doing magical chanting, one was called brumming. In other words, you growl low like a bear, or kvittering, or you're twittering like a bird. And then there's the shaman whistle, which brings things in, which is sort of goes, yeah, nothing like chapped lips for doing a shaman whistle. Oh, well, let me see now. Chat, I know a lot of you for euphemisms. Yeah, sure. Now, you had other people that were sort of the wise ones. You had, of course, the kluk man or the kluk kuna, the wise man or the wise woman. They were essentially the healers, diagnosticians, psychiatrists, herbalists, veterinarians, whatever. And there were many, there could be many in a village. A spåkona or spåkona is a soothsayer. Now, a wise person could do both. And but scythe was generally best done by people who stood between the genders. So if you had the male and the female, you could call on both. So here is where those who were considered gay, as it were, they were extremely powerful, and they could do a lot of stuff. You didn't want to cross a scythe person because they could get you. Are there any questions at this point? I see silence. Oh, Feather, I love your background. Okay. Now, there were many supernaturals in the Norse world besides the gods. Note that Snorri Sturluson did invent a lot of stuff in his writing. So I'm going back to the more basic stuff. For example, Odin was never known in the boonies almost until the Victorian times, when they started translating from Snorri into a language that people could understand outside of Old Norse or Middle Norse. Among the deities that were around, or the supernaturals that were around, one was the norns. They are lowercase n, and there are many of them. Wherever something was being born, there was a norn, a supernatural being that would try to escort that through. And so it wasn't the three norns of Snorri, which he took that from the Greek, the three fates. But earlier it was just, hey, if your cow was giving birth to a calf, there was a norn there, something magically to help the birth go. Sometimes, of course, the person would have to help the calf if it was not an advantageous presentation or whatever. Other spirits were the vetir, and the vetir were like in earth, but they were like spirits. One might call them gnomes almost, and like the nisse. How many of you at Yule have put out the bowl of porridge and you have to put a chunk of butter so that it melts into the hot porridge. So it's called a smørje, or butter eye. And as it melts, you get the aureole around the butter, which is like the sun. And so you put that out so that they would have their feast at Yule, which was the turning of the year. It's not the Christian year, but the turning of the year. And so that they would watch and take care that your farm was protected against evil or whatever unfortunate things happening. They were the good luck bringers. One you wanted to watch out for was called Nukin, and that was a fiddler, a supernatural fiddler who was near water, and he or she or it or they would draw some listeners in to the fiddle and then drown them. So this is where you get drownings. You had ones you had to watch out for, and you had ones that were beneficial, and ones that you, like the vetir or the nisse, that you wanted to be on the good side, like the alfar. Like in Iceland, even today, there were big stones that were considered to be elf homes, and they've had to reroute roads around those stones. If you move the stones, then all sorts of bad luck would happen. So it had to be, and to this day, they still do this. And this is 2022. Okay.
Jane?
Yeah?
I have a question I want to kick back to earlier, much earlier in your talk, because I've been sitting here for quite a while digesting everything you said about where these gods came from, where we know them in a certain form, but they were, it's just like Yahweh as a Babylonian storm god that got imported and so forth. So I want to go back to Odin, who you say came along later in the whole cycle. Now,
Yeah.
one of the central points that I noticed in my study of the runes is the sacrificial act by which Odin gained the runes. Okay,
That
fine.
is Snorri. That is Snorri, and that is Christian.
Is that a
Because you had
snorification?
hanging on the tree. You had hanging on the cross.
All right, so that's a snorification of reality. And I was curious because I wondered, did it actually hail back to an earlier deity that did that, or was that something plastered on later?
Plastered on later.
Okay.
Wodan started out as a tempest and a death god, furious in battle, just blah, down south, and migrated up, particularly through the Anglo-Saxons that went over to England. And then you had that because it would be victorious in war, but he was not an honor god. Tyr was earlier. Tyr is, the name is cognate with Deus, or God, job title. And so Tyr had to lose the hand so that Odin could gain ascendancy, particularly in Snorri's version, because Snorri was much linked to some of the Germanic stuff.
Oh,
and
okay.
If you read the book Lady with a Mead Cup, there's a lot on the early genesis of Odin.
Mhm.
He only got codified later. The earliest epigraphic or written reference to Odin in Norway or in Scandinavia proper was the Ribe skull fragment, which mentioned him and two others, and then against two dwarves. And it seems that may have been an amulet against horrible headaches, and that the death god, because death would take away. Death was used like corpses were used for healing. I'll get into that later in the talk. But
death certainly takes away headaches. But but you talk about how he came in as a tempest god, and my reference to Yahweh, another imported storm god.
No, he was not a storm god. Thor was the storm god. Thor, in Indo-European tradition, the wielder of thunder and lightning was the primary god, and Thor had always been primary. As a matter of fact, in the old altars, the pagan altars, which had the three gods, the primary one was Thor. On one side might be Frey, for fertility, etc.
Right.
And the other, like if you were along the seacoast, might be Njord, who is a sea, the trade at sea, etc. But Odin was never in the center of the altar. So does that?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that actually does
come out in the new age that has really pushed Odin up. And of course, also in Nazi times in Germany, you had that too. But then,
yeah, well,
yeah,
we know what they did, and
but you
I
see,
remember-
there's traditions change as we go along. It's like now a lot of the stuff that's being done with the elder Futhark, like the tile divination, etc., that is now part of the tradition. Traditions move along and get added
well,
to.
things change. I mean, one of the things I was a little startled to realize in a semi-related subject of study of the chakras, that the organization of the chakras according to the Newtonian spectrum is a totally modern invention that's probably less than about 80 years old. And
yeah, it's like the rune tile divination goes back to the 1970s with Alfred Bloom. And
okay.
I managed to have a phone call with him a long time ago, back when we were innocent. And I asked him about it. And he said he'd seen a woman in England doing something like that, but then he did his own system. And the new age, the rune names that they're using for the Elder Futhark runes are actually guessed at rune names in a guessed at Proto-Germanic written by a guy in, I think, one of the 1920s Encyclopedia Britannica. But there are no documented rune names for the Elder Futhark. The closest we get is Anglo-Saxon.
Didn't the last living rune master die in like Finland in the 1500s or something? I mean, there's like zero documentation for a lot of this stuff.
Oh no, there's a lot of documentation, like on the bracteates, on rune stones, et cetera. There's a lot of documentation on the runes, just the runes themselves, and more things are coming up. And also runes were used, particularly in Elvedal in Sweden and Oppedal in Norway, up to World War II, mostly for writing people's names, but also like for magical inscriptions. You put something in runes. And in the 1800s, there was a Danish skipper who wanted to keep things secret where he was going, his rutter or routier, his personal notes. He wrote in runes as a code. So, yeah. So rune use has continued.
Yeah, well, rune use, but I'm talking about a classic rune master of the old tradition. But yeah, if you want to write something in code, write it in High Elvish. There are.
Well, out in the boonies, in the rural areas as opposed to the city areas, a lot of the knowledge was kept on. Like my father's mother and her mother before her and her mother before her. That's where I'm getting my tradition from. It came down, and I think that, of course, now in the age of the internet, etc., so much is getting lost, and people are going away from it, and it's just getting lost. But the old ways, particularly before radio and certainly before television, were strong in the very rural areas. As a matter of fact, in Elvedal in Sweden, which is relatively remote, the language is closer to Old Norse than it is to modern Swedish. The old ways persisted in local areas, and also vertical transmission, down. Whereas modern, we'll have a book which is horizontal transmission. But we had a lot of vertical transmission. And I remember when I was a grad student at the University of Oslo, and I went into a store, the equivalent of a 7-Eleven, and I asked for like a skein, if they had a skein of gray yarn made from the wool of a black sheep and white sheep carded together. And I asked for some lard, and I forget what the third thing was. And the woman behind the counter said, "Are you going to set up practice here? Our wise woman has died and we have nobody." And I went, "Oop." I said, I'm an American student just here at the university, and I have to go home. But they would have hired me as a wise woman right then and there. And this was back in the 60s. The old ways were very strong. I should get going with a talk.
May I ask a question?
Sure, shoot.
I see that so much of this, you talk about male deities. Where is the male-female balance? You did mention it with the scythe, that's LGBTQ, very powerful. But what about where do women come in this ancient thing? Because we've gotten a skewed perception.
Yeah, well, Freya was extremely powerful. Hey, if you could herd cats, you rolled. And Frey and Freya, they were both they were sort of two parts of the same thing, the sexuality, but the fertile earth. Freya was incredibly important in period. Tyr, we don't know whether he had any women around, but the Norns were women. And the most powerful practitioners were women, like the Völva was a woman, the Scythekuna, men were not as much into scythe as women. You had to stand between the genders there. The Spakuna, or the soothsayer, was a woman. And the wise man, there were a few, but generally it was the women. The women were the ones at ground zero, as it were, with the people. And so they dealt with, the people there, and they could, like the scythe people, could channel through. You didn't necessarily have like an Athena and that sort of stuff, but the closest you'd have would be Freya. Frigg was much later. She is cognate with Frau Holle in the south, and came up with Wod or Wodan from the south. And there was a lot of, Snorri invented a lot of stuff. Now, did that answer the question? Yeah. Yes, and the Romans decided
pretty much it's like Freya is the one.
And Romans decided Woden was a German Mercury.
And where are the influences that yes, you have the one goddess, the Freya. You have the influences because, and some of these influences are obviously over life itself and the purpose of life, with the Norns and the Freya making it. Are there others that aspects of Freya or that leads to women being empowered in other ways than what we can?
Yeah, Freya, you did not want to get Freya mad because she could
maternal.
Revenge.
Oh yeah,
Freya
she could knock your butt. Yes.
Oh yeah, you did not want to cross Freya. No way. Even Thor didn't want to cross her. And
no, but in the aspect of women taking something that empowered women to become shield maidens, for instance, or other things.
That would be Freya.
Yes,
Because
sir.
Freya was also a warrior goddess as well as fertility goddess.
Goddess of war and love.
Yeah, you did not cross Freya.
Jane,
Sounds like my kind of girl.
if I could interject here, when the Anglo-Saxons were in the northern tradition, if not they were kind of the first to go, being awfully close to the south. But when they discovered Christianity, which I think they mostly did in order to get trade routes with the Franks, what they would do is they would give their they would take the noble women who would have been the lady with the mead cup in the pagan world, and they gave them an estate, a large hunk of land, and set them up with a religious house. And so when more of the monks from the Roman Church came up and discovered in the 7th and 8th centuries that you had a woman in charge of the religious house with both men and women in it, they were horrified and said, no, you cannot have. And they said, well, why not? You've got, women are in charge of religion. They're in charge of magic. And they just like, we'll handle some of these things, and the women do all of the spooky foo stuff. And once they would, the Romans had to civilize them into understanding that women were supposed to be subordinate, because in the Anglo-Saxon view, of course, you deferred to women in anything religious. And we just lost a lot of stuff because once we were Christianized, you got this male-dominated paradigm who only wrote down their side of the story. So I think that's where we lost a great deal of it.
That's a good valid point. And how much of that became something that cascaded down to where it became from women owned it to where it became distorted, and how have we regained it in the last, God, maybe only 50 years?
Well, remember that Christianity,
what can we do to protect it?
Remember that Christianity was extremely patriarchal, and in the early Norse time, the women had the keys, and they were the ones that ruled the house. And if the man didn't like it, oh well. But the men were frequently out fishing or trading, or in some cases raiding. The women were business owners, and they could inherit in their own right. But I want to keep on going on the supernaturals in the Norse world rather than the rights of women, which is very important, but that's another topic entirely. Now, the one thing that was there were several tools that were very important. One was called Thorvatn, or Thor's water. On Thursdays, you collect rain from a thunderstorm, which was directly sent by Thor. And that water, or hailstones, even better, even snow, but it had to be a thunderstorm on a Thor's day, was touched by Thor. And so that would be used by the brewers. You add a little bit to your brewing vat, and by the law of contagion would infect all of the thing. And so Thor would be watching over, so you would not have a bad brew. More went into the smith's quenching barrel, and so you would get smiavatn, or smiavatn, which is smithy water, which was used for not only medications but other things. And again, since it was quenching iron, it was iron rich, and that would be used in potions against anemia. And washes, the water would also be used like for healing washes, like for eczema or whatever. So Thor's water was very important. You didn't have anything like Odin water or whatever. You didn't, I wouldn't want to get near that. And it was interesting also, a knife, or what was called an angakniv, or angry knife. It was smithied on 3 successive Sundays while the preacher was in the pulpit, from the tips of blades which had taken a human life. And so that was used for like cutting out a tumor, or some things towards the dark in a way, but it was the angakniv. And it's interesting, the blend of the pagan and the Christian there. The childbirth, there was a whole sequence there. You would be calling on the Norns, but it was said in the sagas you have the rune N, Nith, on a fingernail. So since need or famine was there, that it no longer needed to exist for the child. And when a woman was pregnant, bears theoretically wanted to be able to get the child, because the bear could scratch the child could scratch the bear's back and feed it berries, particularly females, but the males would be become berserkers, crazy. And so there were wards against the bears. For a pregnant woman might have a bear claw on a thong around her neck, and the wise woman who was doing the birthing, the midwife, as it were, would have a bear claw. And so, but bears are very honorable. So they would say, oh, rats, there's a bear's paw over the child already. It's already claimed. They were honorable. So this is how you kept the bears away from stealing your, making changelings, because that was the most dangerous things. Now, for protecting around your house, there was a wonderful spell called Thisteel, Misteel, Kisteel. And this is used by pagan and Christian alike. It's the rune Thisteel, M, and then K. And then IIISSSTITTIIILLL. And so decoding this, Thisteel was thistle seed. And you could use flaxseed or thistle seed. And you strew that around the house. And anything evil, including the Christian devil, would have to find and count every single seed. But if you had this carved on runes, particularly like above, you find this in Borgund Stave Church, above where the stillborns were buried, so that the ghosts of the children would not roam. You would have that thistle, so that it was then number of seeds. So whatever evil would have to count every single seed, and since it was step and repeat to eternity. Misteel, mistletoe, was believed to have been planted in the tree by the passage of Thor's hammer. And so that was the battery pack, because like a pickle jar, it always had that aura around it. And Kisteel is defining. Kisteel means a small chest or an enclosed area. So here you had a very powerful spell. And you find that also in nailing down, like say if somebody was a murderer and they buried him, you'd want to have that spell like on a piece of slate over where he was buried, because you did not want him to walk, and this would nail him down. And you remember in Tolkien, I think it was the Barrow Wights, it was something like that. One of the scary ghosts, you had various ones that were scary. The Draugr was people who had died by drowning, and they generally showed up wet, and they would try to mislead ships, etc. They were not as scary as the Yenganger or again walker. Frequently, those would be those of murdered people looking for their murderer or just badasses. And so you'd want to protect against them. There are various ways of doing that. One thing was being sure that you had a sickle or scythe or metal in the roof of the house. Blade up, you could have an angakniv. But the scariest of the supernatural ones were the dead child. Those were the ghosts of stillborns or ones that just died in utero or upon delivery. And so if you were walking along a path and then you heard something like a child crying, you never turned around, you never faced it, but you would say, I name you, girl's name, boy's name. And in Christian times, I christen you, boy's name, girl's name. And having a name, that spirit could again go to the beyond, to the beautiful lands beyond. Note that the goddess Hela originally started out as under the mountain. She was the hostess with the mostest. I mean, Martha Stewart was a Hela wannabe. I mean, there was had a fire going and a feast laid out, and there's tales of like a man riding along on a horse, and all of a sudden the vision opened of under the mountain and his very wet son being brought in and greeted by grandparents. And then he knew that his son had died at sea. But the dead child was very scary because it was looking for the life it never had. You did not want to tangle with that. Let me see how we're doing with time. We still have time. Okay. This is more mundane, but there were people who had the power of milk stealing or butter stealing. And so the charm against that is, your churn. In the bottom of the churn, you would have like a divot, and with some pine tar or something, you would put in a bed crystal, which is a clear quartz crystal. And so the one who was going to steal that would come in, psychokinetically come in, see the crystal, and then go, ooh. And by the time they were finished oohing, you've gotten the butter. But you could also, if you saw a little whirlwind nearby, toss a knife through it, and that would injure the milk or butter stealer. And because, that was valuable. And so if somebody all of a sudden had more butter and no cows, or had milk and no cows, and was also sporting a wound or two, you knew what would happen there. The evil eye was something. Now, it's called Ovund. And so some people knew that they had the evil eye. So they would look aside or look down. They would not look somebody in the eyes if they knew. The evil eye, there were all sorts of spells that people wanted to get the evil eye so that they could nail the opponents. But apparently it seemed to have been just something that was more like genetic. This is that you just got or was inflicted on you. Are there any questions at this point? Can't say it's the same tradition, but sounds similar. Names are close. Shield or drum. Freya on screens having a spear. Yes. At her feet would be some thought was a shield. Could have been a drum. I don't know, but it may have been like in that particular version, a Sami shaman drum, but that would have been more closer to Skadi rather than Freya. Yeah. Any other questions at this point?
Can you say more about the evil eye?
Oh, the evil eye. There were people that had it, and say if they looked at somebody's cows, the cows would all of a sudden give bad milk or get mastitis or fall dead. And so, people getting accused of the evil eye, that's where some of the people that were accused of witchcraft in the witchcraft burning. Of course, in Norway, they were a lot pleasanter about it than down south. What they do is they'd get the witch drunk, put her on a pole, and then poof into a fire. So it would be pretty much instantaneous, but still a bad way to go. But the evil eye, if somebody was told, guess what? And if they were able to avert their glance, then the evil eye would not strike. There was also the evil tongue, where some people could say something and just, we see this in politics all the time, meow. And, but there was the healing tongue also, like the king's tongue, which theoretically, if the king licked somebody, the power would heal somebody. You see this in some cultures. Okay, let me see now. Okay, nothing else on chat. In conversion, when they converted from pagan times to Christian times, it would be the same building, but the pagan would be in the north, and in the center, you had your three idols, Thor always in the center, Frey and possibly Freya on one side, and like Njord or whichever other god was or goddess was of that area. Incidentally, the god Heimdall means home valley, and he was described as having golden teeth, but that is reflecting the golden mustache of the thunder god in Kiev, or Kiev, one must pronounce it Kiev now, which was the thunder god in that area because that was the lightning. So he was a primary god, and Snorri in his time bemoaned the fact that a lot of the lore on Heimdall had already been lost. Let's see now. So in the north you had Thor and the pagan, and then you could just go over to the east. In the center would be Jesus, and you have Sancta Maria or Saint Mary, and you would have somebody else, whoever, on the other side. And so you could go from one to the other. It was relatively peaceful compared to the continent. The continent, the Christians tended to be a lot more vigorous about enforcing their version of religion. Whereas in the north, you could go from one to the other. And on more than one runestone, it was said that so-and-so got baptized. Of course, when you got baptized, you got a nice, clean, new linen shirt. Now, getting woven material. And then he went to another place, got baptized again, maybe a year later, and got another shirt. So, there was, yeah. So it was okay to have them all both in the same building. Incidentally, for divination or healing, and I should show this here. Chippa Khan, by the way, is my cover artist. And this is my book, The Way of the Wise. And you'll see that there is a spoon. This is melted lead. And the best lead was taken from the north window of a Christian church on a Sunday at midnight. And then that was used to pour through flatbread into a bowl of water, which had come from a north flowing brook. And the patterns that were formed by that lead would be interpreted, would be used in diagnosis. And so, hey, you had this melding of traditions. Now, another thing was, if you remember from the Oseberg ship find, there were the animal heads that had sort of the teeth that sort of came together. And in the ship find, they found them lying down in the ship, and through the mouth, held by the clenched teeth, was a long linen rope, and on one side was a kruk, which was like a oval thing with things, and there was the kruk was a hook, and the wrangle was a rattle, and that was used in the old days for herding sheep. A Norse sheep could go up a vertical slope a lot faster than a Norseman and his pony, but you hook the hook on your belt, and then you throw this thing out on the length of 9 meter or something rope ahead of the sheep, and that'll herd him back. Then this was used for herding away the evil spirits or something from the place where the person had died to the place where the person was buried. So you would have the animal head, and some of them were found with boards sticking out back, so they were processional animals. So one person would have the hook on his belt, the rope would pass through, linen rope, pass through the thing, and another person would be throwing this thing around and scaring off evil or acquisitive nasties that might want to glom onto the spirit of the dead person. And it was probably 2 people per side of the board, which is where Odin's 8-legged Sleipnir horse came from, because that had 8 legs. If you had a horse that had 8 legs, there's no way he's going to be able to walk. But but this was the death horse, and which would circle around, and then that would everything, the head and the with the rope and the hook and the wrangle would be put in the grave and buried. Yeah.
So rather than horses, you're talking about
This was equivalent
one
of
to the right, one to the left
you would
to
have
escort.
what?
You're talking about one sheep to the right, one sheep to the left to escort.
You would have one person on one side of the head,
Yes.
with the thing coming back, and then one person to the other side. And the one here had the hook on his belt anchoring it, and the other person was throwing it on both sides all the way to where the how was.
Okay. So you basically looked at 2 sheep, or 2 skulls, to whatever.
No, there was nothing to do with sheep skulls.
Oh, okay. I missed it. Never mind.
No, the tool was originally designed as a sheep herding thing. Like the Christian has a crozier, which was originally a sheep herding thing.
Yes.
And then that was just for grabbing a sheep. Whereas this one was for herding.
Herding.
They didn't have those nice dogs. You know, those dogs that answer whistles, those border collies?
Border collies, no. Yeah. Peers I got.
What? Pairs?
Yes, I had border collies. Now I have peers.
Oh, okay.
I do raise sheep. This is very interesting because to me, how to take herding that energy is very interesting to me.
Yeah, see, this was used, the wrangle, or rattle, was used to scare away, to herd away, to clear a path so that the dead person could be carried without something glomming on, and then it becoming like a genganget or a genwalker. So this was, again, preventative medicine, as it were. And in Denmark, they used to have special death doors so that when somebody died in the house, that they'd open the death door and the corpse would be put on a plank or whatever and slid through, but no living thing should go through because that was going through the death thing. So they would slide it through and somebody on the outside would pull it through, and then the death door would be closed. So, and the dead were considered to be able to take away ailments. For example, in Christian times, you would have like a sick baby or whatever, you'd pass them through this is after the church theoretically was closed for the night. And as soon as it was closed for the night, then all of a sudden, all sorts of action took place. So you'd pass them through the vestments so that would scrape off the ailment. The priest would have to deal with it. Or loaning, you would take pebbles from a graveyard and use them in the magic, but you'd also have to leave a coin or something of value, because when you'd done the magic, then you had to put the coin back, and then you could recover your coin or whatever.
Thank you.
So, yeah, but it's really sort of interesting. We're coming up on the end. If there's any questions or whatever at this point, I could go into medicine or whatever, but we were mostly working on the supernaturals, and
We could have you back to do a whole hour on the medicine.
yeah, we down the line.
Yeah, I would.
You,
go
you were
through that.
talking
Go
about,
a whole bunch of doing much more in depth on all of this.
Oh, yeah.
And
So,
another
remember-
topics to cover.
Allow me
Hey,
to
Jane,
say,
I-
I'm going to point out that we do have a whole channel on YouTube, and all you have to do is go over to YouTube, look up Changing Times, Changing Worlds, and we have a channel, and you can watch many other worldlies. I guess we have about 80 now, and we'll keep adding. This is because I like workshops and panels. So they humor me, and YouTube is available. So, but I
you
think it's time. I'm going to get one last call for any questions about what.
I got a question.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I got a question. Jane, you were talking about the shaman or the early magicians. They had a call that was like a growling and one like a
Growling.
twittering.
Yeah, brooming, you're growling like a bear, or twittering, you're twittering like a bird.
Yes. Is that
That
from
came
the
from the
Noida or the Sami, or is
Sami,
that
that
from,
came from the Sami.
so that's like throat singing, isn't it?
Not exactly, but I see the similarities, but throat singing is a little different. But again, that's what Tibetan.
Well, you got it all through Asia, and then I've listened to some people doing the yoiks, and some of them get that kind of overtones with like the twittering in it.
If you see the movie The Pathfinder, Visiter, you will see the yoik in that.
Yeah, I've seen that, and that I just find it interesting. But those are two different types of throat singing, undertone and overtones.
Yeah.
And or someone could speak.
It wasn't just speaking, like the Christians would just speak out, whereas with the Sami, you had long-term, extensive cultural contact, and so there was a lot that went into Norse that you did not find in the Germanic at all, and so you had these influences, particularly in the rural areas as opposed to the more urban areas. Like the urban areas would be interested in trade and whatever, and would be more influenced by the South but the rurals, particularly right near where the Sami were, and with the reindeer and they trade and back and forth.
Yeah.
So
It's
there was
interesting because we talk about the rural areas, and I was thinking quite a bit earlier in the discussion, if you went and watched all 80 YouTube videos of these meetings, you would realize that there are an awful lot of people who show up here either as guest attendees or as featured speakers who talk about things they learned in rural areas from older people who were still attached to that. And I recall references to Appalachia and other areas. And you realize that you get out there outside the cities, and there is just this incredible mass of knowledge still out there. And it's kind of fun to show up here and see it.
Yeah, and sadly enough, in this days of the internet and television and communication, airplanes and even railroad trains, you get much more going back and forth. Whereas in the old days, you had people settled in particular one area, and you had traditions that were really that vertical transmission. Like I'm probably the last of my generation, you know, in my family that is interested in the old lore, that has the old lore. None of my family is remotely interested, which is why I'm so busy trying to teach as much as I can. Because
Yeah,
you don't want to lose it.
my mother's side of the
Also-
family came from Sweden, and I never heard any of this from my grandparents.
Also, some of us we have found that we have certain things that we can do. And I need to find grounding, and I'm searching and I'm trying. So any info that can come about to historically align me with my ancestry, because I know how I can kick butt. Yes, I know that, but I want to align it, and I'm looking for that. If anybody can help with that, and I'll butt out.
Well, I am glad to hear any of it, because I think I am like Aisling and a bunch of other people, a person who has a daily spiritual practice rooted in ancient traditions, and who still has to get up every day and figure out what to get at Wegmans and how to deal with the bank balance and all of that. And I keep remembering what I was taught about Zen was that it was about making appropriate decisions in an imperfect world. And we need all help we can get.
And you were lucky, dude.
Well, I'm going to finish up with the recording and not stop it, so if anybody has things to say. And thank you again, Jane, and look
Yes,
forward
thank you.
to the upcoming shows.
Yes, thank you, Jane.